Well, what do you say we get started?
So you want me to tell you the story of my life? I'll tell you my story. I'll tell you all of it.
Gee, how?
I'm flesh and blood, but not human. I haven't been human for 200 years.
From the novel by Anne Rice. From Neil Jordan, the director of The Crying Game.
I've come to answer your prayers. Life has no meaning anymore, does it?
His name is Lestat.
But what if I could give it back to you? Pluck out the pain and give you another life. One you could never imagine. I can see you lying on a bed of satin.
He chose one man. He gave him infinite power, eternal life, and a daughter who would be forever young.
This is the only real evil left.
And then he took the light of day.
You're a vampire who never knew what life was until it ran out in a red gush over your lips.
I can't stand this any longer.
You made us what we are, didn't you?
God kills indiscriminately, and so shall we.
You like dying? You condemn me to hell! Monster.
One happy family.
Take her, Louis, end her suffering and yours. For do not doubt, you are a killer.
I want some more.
Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Stephen Ray, Antonio Banderas, Kirsten Dunst, and Christian Slater. Interview with the Vampire.
Well, what do you say we get started?
So, what do?
I'm a vampire.
I think one of the genius qualities to the film is that Neil Jordan was so bold in pursuing that theme, that they are really evil. They do take life, and they do drink blood in order to survive, and they're kind of stuck with it.
Once all of the characters become vampires in a way, you know, once Louis and Lestat establish their relationship, become vampires, they're kind of left squabbling through eternity, aren't they, in a way?
You really believe this, don't you, that you're a vampire?
We can't begin this way. Let me turn on the light.
I thought vampires didn't like the light.
We love it. I only wanted to prepare you. Christ! Don't be frightened.
I was sitting one night in my office at home in Berkeley. I was completely unpublished and unknown, and it occurred to me, what if you could interview a vampire? What if you could get that vampire to sit down and tell you what being a vampire was like? What if he would tell you everything? What it was like to drink blood, whether or not he suffered a swoon when he drank blood, what it was like to be immortal. I just decided it would be fun to do it. So I wrote a short story called Interview with a Vampire, and I kept it for about 2 years. And then I pulled it out while I was working on a collection of short stories, and I started to work on it, and it just took off.
How can I put you at ease? Shall we begin like David Copperfield? I am born, I grew up. Or shall we begin when I was born to darkness, as I call it? That's really where we should start, don't you think? I'm flesh and blood, but not human. I haven't been human for 200 years.
I was sent a copy of the book by David Geffen just after I'd done The Crying Game, and of a script, Anne Rice's script, and I was flying to Paris, and he asked me to read it on the way, which I did, and I was instantly intrigued. you know, totally. I'd heard about the project for years because it had such a reputation, you know. They'd been trying to make it for about 20 years, I think, didn't they? And I'd spoken to various directors at different times who were talking about it. But I'd never read the book, but when I read the book, there was such atmosphere in it, you know, I could put it with a knife. And I was about to do various other projects, and I kind of put them all on hold to do it.
David Geffen really wanted to make it. That was the main thing. And David Geffen, as far as I know, became the real hero of Interview with the Vampire. He decided that he was going to get this thing made, and he was going to draw all the elements together. And I remember when he called me and asked me if I wanted to write the script, I was kind of frightened. It had been over 15 years since I'd written the book, and I didn't know whether I could re-enter this material. But then I thought, well, you know, this is a big opportunity. Go ahead, Anne, do this.
You know, I use the books as a reference for me, and you know, you have to read them, especially Interview with the Vampire, because it's from Louis's point of view. You have to read it very carefully to find the clues to who Lestat is, and you know, his loneliness and his personal struggle. He recognizes that Louis is a unique being, and if he wanted, you know, it's that whole thing, and then Lestat gives him the choice, very clearly, even in the book, Lestat gives Louis the choice. And that's something I felt very strongly about. And when Lestat asks Louis,
Do you still want death? Or have you tasted it enough?
he's really asking Louis, do you still want to die? I mean, now you know you've come close to death. Is this what you want?
One lesson you taught me. Never drink from the dead.
Louis! Put me in my coffin. Put me in my coffin.
I'll put you in your coffin!
Through conversations with Neil, and part of the conversations we had when I was in Dublin, and going through, you know, how the sequence could work, was the concept of that literally all of his life would drain away, that he would shrivel and come down to that of the look of almost a corpse, almost of an Auschwitz victim, someone dying possibly of AIDS, where their life has been drained away from them. Key to this working as an effect would be the performance of Lestat dying. And key to this effect working was that, although, what people don't realize is that once Lestat is on the ground and his throat is cut and he is literally dying and that camera is pushing in, it is no longer a Tom Cruise in this movie. At that point, it's a robot.
And that was going to be the big shot, you know. But it ended up being fairly seamless, and no one really noticed it all that much, you know, like we had hoped they would, and because it was just too subtle. Which is the way we liked it. Neil and I started to develop this sort of thing of that any effect that would actually be in there should not really be noticed outwardly. It might be a subliminal thing, you might catch it, you might not. And we started to attack all the other scenes that way, that everything that you saw there was actually very, very simple looking, even though it might be very complex to do.
He loved the ideas that we were dealing with. He loved the fact that we'd be dealing with effects that actually would be almost invisible, you know? And oddly enough, kind of guaranteed he wouldn't be nominated because people wouldn't notice them. They wouldn't know what was effect or what was design, that kind of thing, you know, but he actually loved the subtlety of what we were doing.
Neil's request for what they would look like, and in his mind was that, you know, that feeling of a burned log that is turned to ash, that it's holding itself together, that still has its shape, but if you were to touch it, it would crumble, was the feeling that he wanted from these two ash bodies. And so the first step was to create that visual element. What do these two characters look like burned up, all in one shape before they've fallen apart? And that became a sculpture. It became this incredibly amazing ashen sculpture. That's the first step. Always the first step. The art is the first step. The art always wins. We never go to the technology before we take care of the art.
We took Stan's design and then we cut it apart in a bunch of different pieces, wired it all together with motion control, and just basically start pulling the wires so that the arm would fall off and the hand would fall off and this would go in a very specific pattern. Added a bunch of 50 elements of dust and things breaking apart, and when you look at it, it looks kind of like what you'd imagine if you touched something that was all basically burned to a crisp, like an ash on a cigarette. It would just fall apart that way. And we spent a long time, like a month or 2 months, working solid on the shot to try to make it look like you didn't do anything. You just built it, like Stan built it. Basically, Neil wanted something for the Santiago character to do, and we were in a tunnel in Paris, and he said, I want him to dance on the ceiling of the tunnel. And it's like, well, there's only really one way of doing it. There's a couple little tricks you can do now that wasn't done in the 40s. The Fred Astaire trick is you build a steel cage with a set built inside of it, and the camera and the steel cage revolve, and it's they're basically giant revolving rotisserie, essentially, and then you film inside it. And the real trick is the actor or the dancers. And the way Fred Astaire did it so well is that he could dance and hide the feeling that the gravity is now shifting seamlessly, so you couldn't tell when it actually turned. And that's what Stephen Ray had to do, who's not necessarily a dancer, and we had a choreographer do it. And it was one of the last things we shot, I think, on the movie, is Brad Pitt coming over, and we made the shot look like you were shooting over his shoulder, who's standing upright while he's dancing on the ceiling background, so we had to shoot them separately. And that was the last bit, and Neil saw the take he liked, which was take 23, if I remember correctly. And that was the end of it. It was like one day, do the Fred Astaire gag, and do it hopefully as seamlessly as that was done.
In my death scene, where I have my torso cut, I think Brad Pitt cuts me from here to here. So this little bit of me is lying on the floor, sort of grunting, and I had to stick my head and part of my arm through this hole in the floor, and Stan Winston said, "Don't worry, you won't be there for very long. It'll be uncomfortable, but you won't be there for very long." And I said, "How long?" He said, "Oh, an hour." An hour? That's really a long time to be uncomfortable, And but it's worth it, and just for that moment in the film, and it's only a moment.
You said you found nothing?
Peasant rumors, superstitions about garlic, crosses, the old stake in the heart. But one of our kind, not a whisper.
So there are no vampires in Transylvania, no Count Dracula?
Fictions, my friend. The vulgar fictions of a demented Irishman.
So when we get to interview with the vampire, I think that we're really facing a kind of intra-view, because we do get an inside view of the vampire as he is split within himself, divided from himself, different from himself, and in conflict.
There are a number of professors today who are teaching classes on vampire fiction. And I think it's marvelous. I think everybody has come to realize that the vampire is an incredible metaphor for the outsider in all of us and the outcast in all of us.
I guess one could speak today of the vampire having a fan club precisely to the extent that we're living in a situation or in a mass media culture that is oversaturated now, or supersaturated with our ability to identify with the vampire, with all the occult loner figures. There's no room for the loneliness of the vampire or the werewolf any longer, except to the extent that it is the loneliness of every adolescent. I mean, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is basically group therapy for teenagers at this point.
People don't do things to be evil. They don't, you know, they do things because they think they're right. And they think what they're doing is right. And it just so happens that it can be evil to others. So it was really important to understand that and understand Lestat's loneliness. And, you know, because he really does love Louis. He really does love Claudia. And he does feel that what he's giving them is this wonderful gift of eternal life, and to join him in what he perceives to be the greatest adventure ever.
Well, perhaps this is the only real evil left.
God does not exist.
I know nothing of God or the devil. I have never seen a vision nor learned a secret that would damn or save my soul. And as far as I know, after 400 years, I am the oldest living vampire in the world.
I would say that immortality is actually something that we do experience all the time within our short attention spans in every moment. We have access to the experience of immortality. It just doesn't come to us pure and unmixed. It's always shadowed at the same time by the loss of the other.
I've searched the world for an immortal, and this is what I find.
Bring the petite beauty with you. No one will harm you. I won't allow it.
Apparently there were theaters in Paris in the late 1800s that did have horror shows for mass audiences, or big audiences, but I didn't know that when I wrote in the book that there was a theater of the vampires. The idea just popped into my head. It was another one of those things. I was sitting there just writing away, and I thought, okay, Louis is in Paris, he's looking for the vampires. What if there's a whole theater of them, you know, theater of the vampires, and they're pretending to be human beings, pretending to be vampires on the stage? How clever. I just wrote it.
But there was a theater of Grand Guignol in Paris that opened in the late 19th century. It really was the first horror establishment. It sort of was the rehearsal of horror movies in many ways. And it continued all the way up to World War II, I believe.
Grand Guignol was to do with blood and cruelty and the enaction of horrific events on stage, like people having their eyes taken out and disemboweled and all this stuff, you know. It's like spectacle of kind of pain and misery.
What was so distinctive about the Grand Guignol horror sketches was that they served at the same time, and I think this is interesting, as introductions to the latest in media technologies and also medical technologies. So the horror skit would involve, say, surgery on stage. The most effective playlet in terms of people passing out in the audience ever performed was a realistic blood transfusion on stage. And another thing, to give an example of media technologies, there was something called, in fact, the telephone, where a man on stage simply listened on the phone to his wife and kids being murdered at the other end of the line.
To say that I don't believe in something. You know, I really wouldn't feel right saying I didn't believe in them. I also don't want to say they exist, of course they do, but I think I believe in something.
I think it's just part of the popular imagination, basically. I believe there are people probably that have a tendency to cross the line, probably a line that is at the end of sex, could be at the end of mental illness too. And there are some people who cross that line and may live like vampires, may imitate them, but for sure I can tell you that they cannot buy time. I don't think nobody can live more than they were supposed to live, you know, as a normal person. So I don't believe in vampires at all.
Well, I believe in vampires because the weekend this movie opened, there was about 40 people across the United States who cut somebody else and drank their blood, you know, so they seem to believe in them. Do I believe in vampires? No, I think vampires are metaphors for all the uneasiness we have about everything, you know.
I myself have not met any real vampires, but, you know, we have a great big vampire ball every year here in New Orleans. Lestat has a fan club. I don't, but he has a fan club that's existed for about 10 years, and they have a ball, and the ball is huge. One year I gave the ball, and we had 8,000 people. But many, many people come to that ball whom you would swear are real vampires. They have contact lenses that make like cat eyes for their eyes. They have bonded fangs on their teeth. They have long fingernails. And the ball is a wonderful place to be the Saturday before or after Halloween just to see these kids, because it's really quite incredible. But to my knowledge, no real vampires have ever showed up at that ball.
Whatever happened to Lestat, I do not know. I go on, night after night. I feed on those who cross my path.
My nails were this big, they were big. And I am alone in this hotel, you know. It's this huge hotel in London, and I'm alone in the sauna with my long nails all naked, you know. And suddenly 4 Japanese guys got in the sauna. I don't know. Okay. And they sit in front of me. And they do immediately walk to the fingers, you know, looking at the nails. 3 or 4 of them looking at each other, looking at the nails. And I said, I know a vampire movie. And they look at each other. Vampire? Yeah, vampire. Vampire? Yeah, all right. And they stood up and left.